College of Ag Water Management Assistant Professor position, which will also support the new Water Science and Management MS and PhD degrees. Christine Kirchhoff is a research fellow at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. She was a postdoc and fellow at the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research at CU Boulder. Her research interests focus on social studies of science applied to production and use of information and water resource management and human dimensions of global change. Since completing her PhD, she has continued her focus on water resource management, governance, and the information used through work on new projects examining state-level water planning and management, adaptive capacity, and information use. She has a master's in environmental and water resource engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD in resource policy and behavior from the University of Michigan. Christine, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Sam, and thank you all for braving the early hour and coming out to see this talk. Appreciate it. So it's great to be here in New Mexico. I really got interested in New Mexico during my dissertation research, which I completed a few years ago. And I had a chance during that research to talk with different water managers here in the state and learn about the unique challenges that New Mexico faces. It really struck a chord with me. It's an interesting state with very interesting problems, and it's great to be here and part of this discussion. So what I wanted to start with before I talked about the research was to give you a little bit of information about my background, to sort of flesh out and tell you a bit about how I got interested in water management in the first place. And as Sam mentioned, my disciplinary background is it's multidisciplinary with engineering and both a bachelor's and a master's in engineering. And it was really during that engineering education that I became interested in water resources, management in particular. And then when I graduated and started working as an engineer, I had an opportunity to work with different water managers from rural areas to more urban areas, and with state level planners. And that really further reinforced my interest in water management. As an engineer, I looked at different water management problems, for example, from the city of Junction, and learned about how rural areas, the particular challenges that they face in trying to meet regulatory requirements. It's, with limited funding available and a small staff, it's sometimes quite challenging for them to meet effluent discharge permits, for example. For more urban systems, growth was a big driver, helping them develop new water resources to serve that growing population and to support the economic development in the area. Learning also through all that how water managers approach the problem of trying to figure out how to address change and how to manage drought and growth, and whether it's through supply augmentation or more conservation approaches. And in Texas in general, conservation is sort of considered a four-letter word. So it's something that's hard to talk about, and the culture is difficult to change. Same thing with the planning approach. The state legislature, this is an example of how science informs policy and policy enacts change. So trying to get the state water managers to think more broadly about planning for drought and climate, not so much climate change, but really more about climate variability and the use of a historical drought as their drought of record for planning purposes, and trying to understand, how they decide on what information to use in planning. So all of these types of experiences and exposure to working with water managers really informed my decision to return to school and try to look at it from a different perspective. The social science and human side of water management, to get a better understanding of how water managers make decisions, the information that they draw upon to inform those decisions, and how can we manage water better when we try to deal with climate variability and change and the other pressures that we have on the resource from competing uses between ag and urban and environmental flow needs and the like. So that really prompted my return to work through a PhD, and then subsequent training at the University of Colorado, and then another postdoc at the University of Michigan. So now that you have a little bit more understanding of my background and how I came interested in water management, I want to focus now on the seminar organization. What I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about first is the context of the research, where my work fits in the broad area of water management, the specific research questions I was interested in answering, and then the methods for this particular study I'll share with you today that I used to answer those questions. Discuss then key results and findings that are now influencing my current work and future directions, and then hopefully have some time for questions. So I view the resource management, water management problem as a really interrelated, complex problem. It starts at the resource base, but certainly isn't limited by the quantity that we have and the quality of the resource base. There's a number of things that influence it. This, of course, is not all-inclusive, but just thinking about, the ways that the climate cycle and the things that we do on the landscape affect the quality and quantity of resource available, as well as, where I rest in understanding the management and governance of how do we manage to keep the quality at an acceptable level and manage the quantity that's available. And the other primary aspect which I work is information about the climate cycle, about landscape change, about the resource itself and the interactions between these, informing management so that we can improve the management process. So when we think about, and I would argue, and there are other scholars in this area as well, that in thinking about climate variability and change in particular, a critical driver for improving water management is better understanding, is really an information-driven challenge, better understanding the climate and these interactions with water management, and getting that understanding better incorporated into management decisions. So how does that happen, and how do we make that happen? And then the second is a more management functioning approach and understanding, and that is moving systems, moving our management frameworks to be more adaptive. And by adaptive and resilient, I mean that taking a broader perspective, not looking at the resource from a single sector approach, just at urban water needs or just at the environmental needs or just at ag needs, but really looking more holistically and not looking at a single scale, for example, but looking more broadly at the larger scale, a landscape scale, a watershed scale. Also accommodating feedbacks. So that's again, bringing back to that information and learning component, is having an adaptive and resilient management approach in place that's actually flexible and allows us to change as we go along and learn more, and is explicit in including information in that process and feeding it back in to inform those changes. So those are the two components of how we can improve water management, and that's where I focus in trying to understand those interrelationships from two perspectives. So when I talk about climate information, many of you might be familiar with what climate information entails. This is just an example from the climate assessment of the Southwest. Water managers routinely use instrumental record of flow, for example, in streams or aquifer levels. But the instrumental record only gives us a record from the point that we've been taking measurements. So it's usually 30 to 100 years. And these paleo reconstructions using tree rings allow water managers to see much further into the history of the climate variability over a much longer period of time. So rather than relying on a 100-year record, they can see the cycle of droughts that have hit this area, this particular watershed, for a much longer time. So that can help inform the planning and decision making and their response to droughts that they may not have experienced yet. Besides things like paleoclimate reconstructions of stream flow, there are drought monitoring and drought projections, This is an example of a 3-month drought outlook, so this could give a water manager or a farmer an opportunity to think about the anticipated precipitation patterns, whether they're improving or continuing to worsen. And then climate change information being another example. This is from the new National Assessment Report for the Southwest, showing anticipated changes in precipitation for the spring months under 2 scenarios, a lower emissions and a higher emissions scenario. So again, while this isn't something that would be incorporated next year by water managers, but could inform the much longer trajectory of planning at a much longer time scale. So the challenge that we face in terms of information in particular is that there is, despite the need to include information in decision making, and despite the fact that there's an awful lot of information out there and our understanding about drought and climate change continues to improve, not that the uncertainty is diminishing, but there's a lot of attention to these issues and a lot of information being produced, but there continues to be a persistent gap in how much of that actually gets incorporated into decision making. So I study management and information use from 2 perspectives. One is the social studies of science, which focuses on the information production side and how information is incorporated into policy and decision making. And then from the human dimensions of global environmental change perspective, which is really focusing on the interactions between humans and the environment, in this case, our management of water resources. So to understand how to approach this problem of information use from the social studies of science side of things, we can look at models of information uptake. This is what's called the linear model, and the basic idea of the linear model is that science is produced, all science is inherently useful. We produce it in the academy or wherever, the national lab, etc., and then we send it out into the ether, into society at large, and that information is recognized as useful and is taken up immediately in decision making. But in fact, we can apply this more specifically to climate information and water managers' information use. But research shows that it really doesn't work that way. It's not an easy flow from production to uptake in decision making. So there have been new models that are proposed, and one of these models is the collaboration or co-production model. And this incorporates much more interaction between the producers of information and potential users of information through something that's called boundary work, which includes that communication, that interaction, more explicit ties between producers and users of information. And generally speaking, it's boundary organizations that do this boundary spanning work. And that's because they can be in place for a long enough or a continual period of time to sustain those interactions. These aren't interactions that are sort of one and done, that are often take place over a period of time where that understanding grows. And so boundary organizations enhance and sustain communication. They work a lot on translating information to be more useful. And examples of these include things like watershed councils, university extensions, and rural water associations, and many, many others, including the organization that I'm going to talk about today. These are RISAs, which are Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments. They're funded by NOAA. They started funding these centers in the 1990s, late 1990s. And they have the explicit goal of providing climate information that's regionally relevant. So whichever region that they're working in, the idea was to bring scientists together with resource managers, not just water managers, but they're interested in helping ag incorporate climate information, forest managers, fisheries, etc. And there are 11 different ones across the U.S., including one in Alaska and one in the Pacific Islands. And so it's helpful that they are really focused on producing climate information for uptake and helping the nation and regional stakeholders and clients adapt to climate variability and climate change.
looking at the literature that examines boundary organizations in general and RISAs in particular, suggests that these RISAs really do help information uptake because of that boundary spotting process, because their goal and mission is really to be that for the region and to provide information that's usable. But in reviewing the research, what I found was that in general, it's a collection of case studies that looks at a single boundary organization. They tend to be qualitative with a small sample size, so offering quite rich understanding of the particular organization that they're studying, but perhaps somewhat limited in the generalizability of the results. They also don't tend to look at uptake beyond the particular boundary organization. So in examining a single boundary organization, talking with the clients that they work with and the people, the scientists in the boundary organization itself, but not looking beyond to see the impact beyond those relationships. And in the case of the RISAs, the authors are often affiliated with the RISAs, which doesn't mean that the research is bad, but that it does call into question a little bit the objectivity of the research. So my questions are aiming at building on this research that's been done before to give a better understanding of what drives water managers' use of RISA information in particular and climate information more generally. And second, to understand if there are limits to this model that is clearly effective, but whether, there's this discussion of climate services out there, and the RISAs are seen as a model for climate services, and the question is that an appropriate model for all users and all uses of climate information? So I try to contribute to the literature by using a different methodological approach than had been done before, taking a broader sample, so not just focusing on the RISAs and their clients, but also looking at water managers in the region, using a mixed method, so taking advantage of the rich information you can get from interviews and qualitative studies, but also look at surveys of the broader population to get the more robust information and data source. Compare regions and scales, so not focusing just on local water managers, but looking at state and regional water managers as well, looking at across scales of, across regions where these RISAs work, and then trying to empirically test and compare these different models of uptake. So if we think about trying to look at the effectiveness of a boundary spanning model, the collaborative model, or the linear model, and actually empirically test uptake. So I focused on 2 RISAs. What was the climate impacts group in the Pacific Northwest when I did this research, which is housed in University of Washington, or was at the time, and encompassing Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. And then the climate assessment of the Southwest, which is focused at the University, or housed at the University of Arizona, and encompasses both Arizona and New Mexico. I chose these RISAs because they're 2 of the longest running RISAs, so they have had an opportunity to develop clients and develop products, and I could test or see the maturation process and the uptake of information. If it was a much younger RISA, it takes some time for these relationships to be established and information to really get and become more useful. I focused on these 2 because they had a water management focus. So not all of the RISAs have such a strong water management focus, but these 2 are. And there was interesting management challenges in both, including drought in both regions. Of course, we're more familiar with the droughts of the Southwest being so severe and long-lasting, but there are challenges in the Pacific Northwest as well, particularly because of the endangered species with the salmon runs and the need to keep cool water temperatures for their survival, and the snowpack issues in the Pacific Northwest with it diminishing in quantity and melting sooner, which is also having impacts in the Southwest. So the methods I employed were interviews and surveys. I conducted almost 50 interviews split between the RISA programs and then the water managers in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest. For the RISAs, I was interested in understanding the evolution of the RISA, what they focused on, their interaction strategies, how and what types of information they produced. And then for the water managers, it was a non-random sample, so it was the clients the RISAs identified for me that they worked with. And I was interested in understanding aspects about the water manager themselves, himself or herself, the system characteristics of the size of the system and where it was located, and how they used climate information and what they used, the decisions around using it and their interaction with the RISA, for example. The survey was region-wide. I ended up with 667 responses. I targeted community water systems serving 25 or more people across the 5 states, the 3 in the Pacific Northwest and the 2 in the Southwest. There were 24 questions, a mix of open and closed-ended questions, trying to get at some of the same information that I got out in the interviews with the water managers. So understanding their issues of concern, their operation and planning, things about the water manager himself and the system, himself or herself in the system, and then their collaboration and use of information. And then it was comparative across the 2 regions, Pacific Northwest and the Southwest, scales of decision making, and then models of uptake. So now I'll step through how I use this research design to answer the 2 questions I presented earlier. So with the first part of the first question, what drives water managers' use of information in general? I could draw on the broader population of water managers that are using climate information from other sources, and that representing a semblance of the linear model, so not having the advantage of interacting with the RISAs. I could also look across to see what might be common about information users, about these water managers who are using climate information, so those that are working with the RISAs and those that are getting it in from other places. To answer the second part of the first question, the use of RISA information in particular, I used the RISA interviews with the clients. I also explored among the broader population that used RISA information to see, again, what might be common between the drivers of the information use, and in allowing or using the benefits, again, of the qualitative data to learn more about what might be driving uptake in the broader population. And then for the second, are there limits to the co-production model? Looking at then the negative, who's not using it and why, and again, looking across both the qualitative and the quantitative data. So to get at the first question and to understand weaknesses and limits of the model, we have to understand first who uses it. So as we might expect, the majority of the clients are using the information. When we look at one of the strong predictors of information use, it has to do, again, with that boundary work that I described that's essential to the collaborative research model. And in talking with the climate scientists on the one hand and the water managers on the other, it's really clear that it's a very strong, interactive, two-way process where understanding increases on both sides. It's not just the climate scientists understanding more about the information needs of the water managers, it's also the water managers understanding the limits and how the science is produced. And it's that transparency that's helpful for water managers. What's that, putting a light, shining a light in that black box of how paleoclimate researchers develop those reconstructed stream flows, or how global climate change models are downscaled to the regional scale, and those then are used to develop stream flows as well. So water managers appeared very reluctant to just take it on face value. They really wanted to understand more about how this information construction was produced, the uncertainties embedded in it, and what that all meant for them in their decision-making context. Again, as I mentioned in the very beginning, it's not a one-and-done process. It requires sustained interaction, and that's iteration, back and forth as the understanding and learning increases on both sides in order to, for example, tailor it to decision context, or just get to the point where people are more comfortable with what the information is, how the information can be helpful for them. It's also about building capacity for uptake. This has to do, again, with the learning that takes place, but also sometimes water managers invest in more training or people that can be used specifically to bring climate information into their decision making. So it's not a trivial process. None of this interaction is a trivial process. It's it's quite intensive to result in that high rate of information uptake. When we look at what drives RISA information in particular, we know this interaction is a huge component, but there are other aspects that are become apparent in looking through the interview data. And this has to do with the characteristics of the water manager himself or herself. They really do seek information, and not just from the RISA, but more broadly. And they collaborate with universities, not just with the RISA, but more broadly as well. And this behavior is in part motivated by their perception of the risk associated with climate variability and climate change, and having actually experienced drought or flooding or some sort of climate-related risk. And so those types of behaviors are motivating this RISA interaction that we see. In addition to individual water manager characteristics, this interaction is enabled by being closely located to the RISA, so that interaction is not something that seems to work well over the phone necessarily, or in a video conference call, but it's something that in-person interaction really seems to be important here. And to sustain that interaction, it helps to be from larger systems. So the clients in general were from the largest and closest systems to the RISA. These other factors, long-term planning and customers asking them to consider climate change, played a lesser role in information use. This is consistent when we look at the broader population using RISA information. Even though just a few people really use it, it's only 7% of that 667 use RISA information. That's in part because they use information from other sources, from state regulatory agencies, from professional associations that they are involved with. RISAs are really on the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to use of information. To get at the drivers of information uptake, I used a logistic regression with climate information, RISA information use as a dependent variable, exploring things again like population, which is a proxy for system size, collaboration, information sources, the numbers and types of information that they used, their distance from the RISA, and then indicators of climate-related risks, and found that like the interviews, the clients who were working with their RISA intensely, the broader population, the same sorts of variables really rose to the fore when controlling for all the different variables that could have played a role here. When you look at the broader population who use climate information from other sources, finds that there's quite a demand out there for climate information, and this includes different types of climate information, from forecasts to those proxies I mentioned to climate change impacts information. And when you look at these users, the same characteristics motivate their use of climate information from other sources as that motivated RISA information use. But interaction and being close to the RISA and being from larger systems weren't as important drivers. Instead, these other variables that weren't drivers in the RISA use ended up being more important here when you control for other variables. It's this attention, this long-term view that these water managers have. And interestingly, that there's some sort of influence from their constituents, and that they're asking them to consider climate change in their planning and decision making. So back to the research questions: what drives water managers' use of climate information in general? It's really this information seeking, willingness to collaborate, and risk perception that's motivating their use of information. In taking and learning from the qualitative data, it seems to be because they gather and employ climate information to manage risk as a risk management strategy, and because the information is uncertain, they use multiple sources to manage that uncertainty, to really give a portfolio of information to inform the types of decisions they're trying to make. And it's not just the uncertainty of the information, it also has to do with the complexities of their decision environment and the uncertainties that they face in and dealing with other things such as, the population they anticipate having to serve, and maybe trying to do more to protect environmental flows and things like that. So using multiple sources as a strategy to manage the risks that they see. What drives water managers' use of recent information in particular? It's, again, those water manager characteristics I mentioned before, as well as the proximity and capacity pieces. And this really plays out in seeing how many more people really use this information in the home state and how it trails off when you get further removed from where they're located. And that's both consistent in the Pacific Northwest and here in the Southwest. So the second question, which is now again exploring the limits of the collaborative model for large regions or large and small systems. They are principally related to that capacity challenge and the distance challenge. It requires capacity and willingness to sustain engagement. So as I mentioned, it's a quite intensive interactive process that requires, it's not something that's done in a single interaction, but it's something that's done over time. So it really needs, there needs to be the ability to sustain that interaction. And so that means that it works better for motivated water managers from these large systems and doesn't work as well for the smaller systems that are out there, systems that have less capacity to engage, those that are further away, and those that are less willing or able to use climate information. So the principal conclusions from this work in terms of advancing our thinking around both boundary organizations and how we perceive of water managers. In the literature, there isn't much understanding of how water managers interact with information itself. It seems like they're more passive. They're described as being risk averse and ultra conservative, and so not wanting to do anything different or use new sources of information. But what this research suggests is that, in fact, they're active information seekers, and they are concerned and want to use information more broadly and are out there looking for it. And that rather than shying away from using new information or doing things differently, that risk aversion is more associated with not using the information, that it perhaps in wanting reliable supplies, which people thought really made people, again, not willing to use this information. It's what I see as the reverse, that they are, that risk aversion and conservatism actually is driving and helping them, spurring them on to use this information rather than holding them back and keeping them in the same place. It's not universal, of course, not everyone uses climate information, but of those that are using it, they're a different, they're taking on a different side of things, showing a different water manager that's out there. For boundary organizations itself, it suggests that interaction is really costly, and it's not just, I mentioned, the proximity and capacity on the water manager side. Well, the RESAs themselves are also limited in their ability to do these interactions. So each interaction for them is just as costly in some regard as each interaction from a water manager, which means that they can't serve everybody, and that they serve, that these individuals that they serve, it may be harder to move beyond where they're at. But there are suggestions born out of this research on how we might improve it. Part of this has to do with perhaps, in addition to developing relationships with individual water managers or single water systems, that they could work with knowledge brokers, and these are folks who don't necessarily produce the information themselves, but are more connected to users and can help pass that information on. And so by developing relationships with these knowledge brokers, they might be able to increase the uptake of information more broadly with each interaction or each investment that they make. A multi-institutional structure, so rather than housing just at the University of Arizona, but having multiple institutions involved to limit that or mitigate that distance problem, and perhaps also tap into the trust that you already have established with other organizations in other states or other regions. More education and outreach, tapping into the fact that the publics are motivated in some way, motivating in some way the water managers to use information from other sources, so tapping into that, and helping water managers understand how this information can be a benefit to them. And then leveraging sources water managers use routinely, as I mentioned before. There's a small proportion of water managers that use this information. That's because they use information from so many other sources that are more routinized for them. And so tapping into those sources can help distribute this information more readily. And in the broader population, building capacity and capabilities for long-term planning. And right now, there isn't a policy driver for including climate change impacts information per se. Usually there is for drought, but it's not, there is definitely work that could be done on the policy side of things to both help water managers build capacity for planning and perhaps encourage planning in general. And then bolstering public science and citizenship as well as climate literacy, because again of that potential for the publics to influence water managers. So this work is influencing the work I've been doing lately, as well as the work I intend to do in the future. So I'm working in two areas presently. One's on information usability, again, improving theoretical development and more deep ethnographic research, and on boundary organizations and governance more generally. So for the first, we are working, this is from a paper from Lemos, Kirchhoff, and Rampersad, trying to improve on our understanding of the uptake for information. This is again the linear model that presumes that the smooth flow, and what I see in my work and we draw on other work, not just from water resources use of information, but farmers' use of climate information and other sectors as well. And what we see is that there are three main areas that constrain this easy, smooth flow of information from being useful to usable. It's fit, interplay, and interaction. I described the issues with interaction previously, so I won't go back over those. But fit and interplay, fit has to do with the format of the information, maybe the perception of information, of it being salient or relevant to their decision making. Interplay has to do with those decision-making processes that the water managers or people are already using. So it may be difficult to incorporate climate information into those routines that they already have in place and they're already used to using information. So that and other factors like that can restrict that smooth sailing of information across the boundary. We were also interested in understanding how to increase the flow of information, using interaction, customization, even this idea of retailing or wholesaling to broader groups of people. And so all of that is trying to get at thinking about information use more broadly and how we can improve its uptake and span that usability gap that's apparent in the literature. The second area I'm working on is trying to understand interaction a little bit better. So I talked a lot about it. I did indicate the learning and understanding and the transparency issues, but much of the work on interaction, including the work that I presented, is based on sort of one-shot backcasting and recollections of the interactions that took place. So this is really trying to get at looking at this interaction and really observing the interaction over time to see what it is that's changing and how it improves usability. And this is in two watersheds, one in Michigan and one in Ohio. The second area, boundary organizations and governance. This is from a paper that is coming out soon that looks to understand different governance regimes. So integrated water resource management, which is something that is being pushed widely across the world. And then conventional or command and control that's here in the US, and we compared Brazil and the US, Brazil being IWRM. And IWRM is really thought to actually be more conducive to information uptake because it's explicit in the way that the framework is put in place. But what we saw is that it really is the water managers themselves who drive use of climate information, and it has less to do with the governance framework that's in place and more about the water managers and having a boundary organization that they're interacting with. So it's interesting that IWRM in terms of information uptake may not be the end-all be-all, may not be working as effectively as we think to drive at least climate information uptake. The second is from work with the postdoc Lisa Dilling. This is looking at 5 states and selecting those states for different water planning frameworks and different water management and allocation frameworks, and trying to understand what characteristics of these governance regimes might promote that more adaptive and resilient governance that we think we need going forward. We selected them because they, as I said, are different and they face different challenges. What we see from this research is that states play an important role, and that they can do these cross-scale, foster these cross-scale interactions which have a broader view. They can incentivize that, they can put structures in place to bring people together, to learn from each other. When small systems or individuals sometimes have a harder time looking at a watershed scale, there just isn't the resource available for it, so states can help provide that type of broader scale information and make it available for everyone. So there are a number of things that states can do and are doing that seem to be important for this idea of adaptation to climate variability and change. So I have 2 areas of future research that I wanted to share with you. One is this idea of marketing climate information. So there's been a lot of work in understanding individual users. And again, if one of our goals is to increase adoption more broadly, then we need to figure out how to do that. And one idea is to try to understand if there are user types, people that have similar information needs and similar decision contexts. And if we can use strategies, figure out what strategies and information might work to bridge that gap for groups of users. And that's this research. There's a grant application I am PI on to the National Science Foundation to hopefully investigate that. And the second is a grant application for NOAA's Sectoral Applications Research Program, and this is trying to measure climate information use and whether or not it's helpful for adaptation to climate extremes, particularly in this case flooding. So this is looking at stormwater management and other flooding in urban and rural areas. And quickly, I just wanted to acknowledge some of the funding that I received and thank the water managers who, without the participation, I wouldn't have any research to share, and my colleagues at the University of Michigan and the University of Colorado. And that's all I have. I welcome your questions.
I'm not quite sure I understand exactly the relationship between water managers, and I saw in parentheses once that they're information users. I also think of them as practitioners in the sense of the active verb managing, and legislators who you mentioned in the introduction are the ones who actually make policy and affect change. I'm just not clear where those boundaries are. Does your use of the term water managers include legislators or not?
No. So the data that I collected, I did not speak with state legislators, for example. I talked with state folks at state agencies, water agencies, like the Office of the State Engineer here in New Mexico, the Departments of Water in Idaho. So I talked with the state level water managers in each of the states that I looked at, but not legislators.
Right. So if I understood correctly, sort of, when you talked about future research, I think you were alluding to that sort of next boundary there with legislators. Was that correct?
I'm interested definitely in the policy aspects, and so understanding the policies that are already in place and what that implies for what we are doing now and tweaks we could make to improve the policies and improve management. So I don't anticipate necessarily focusing or doing research on legislators, even though I have colleagues who do.
Because it seems that's a real, because a lot of the terminology you used here in terms of information seeking, flexibility in terms of reframing messages and so on, sort of are antithetical to a lot of policymakers
Yeah,
in a practical sense today. I mean, we can all think of examples where they are doing that and examples where they're essentially constructing brick walls.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So I mean, what, not to sound too pessimistic here, but in terms of actually affecting change, it seems to me we have to go beyond the water managers to the legislators.
I mean, I think you're spot on with that, and that's some of what we're getting at in the state work. So again, in the work with Lisa Dilling, which I didn't speak with legislators themselves, but heard a lot about them in talking with the water managers. And in fact, you know, they do have constraints in trying to do, in some cases, what they want to do, ideally, because of the resistance at the legislature. I mean, you look at Texas as an example where there's this great water planning framework in place, but they really can't talk about climate change, you know. But that doesn't mean they're not addressing it. And, you know, so I think change happens at different scales and in different ways, right? And so this information is getting there, and the thing I like about Texas, even though people that I've talked to, other academics are quite pessimistic as well, in terms of their ability to change, but the water managers at the state level, the water managers at the local level, are concerned and are doing something, and this information is getting in there and changing what they're doing, and it, with the way the framework is in place in Texas, it does feed back. You know, they have,
Right.
you know, changed policies based on the science and based on the learning that's taking place. It's a slow process, and I hear you on, you know, the roadblocks and,
Right.
and
But it seems that that boundary there of the brave water managers
yeah,
are the ones who are perhaps at that boundary with the legislators, who are sort of bubbling up questions and problems and issues, and some legislators are, I assume they have the legislators' ears in perhaps in some way.
yeah. I agree, and I mean, we could talk about this, I think, a fair amount, and there's work that I didn't present that I did looking at knowledge systems, which I think gets at that in another way. And so, for example, in Arizona, you saw it a little bit in New Mexico when I was doing the research of these interconnections of the scientists on task force and advising, you know, on panels that advise the governor and,
Right.
you know, all across. And I think it's important that there is this work across scales, because it feeds up and feeds down, you know, and sort of reinforces positive momentum forward. And yet then you sort of get into the practical realities of new policies that are put in place, and all the compromise and stuff that sort of undercuts what gets put out there. But, you know, I hear what you're saying, and I am studying it, but not necessarily
Okay.
directly with the
Right.
legislators.
Right. Thank you.
I think you have your
Yeah, it's sort of a similar question. It's about the definition of what a water manager is. Did you include the governing boards? Because a lot of these utilities, you know, the manager reports directly to a water board. And
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the relationship between the manager and the board had any impact or what's defined as a water manager.
Sure. So specifically, the surveys were of community water system managers, and the interviews were with both water managers at utilities as well as at the state level, and sometimes at different levels, and sometimes in private practice too. There were examples, so I didn't talk with board members, so I understand what you're getting at, and what I found was two things. One is that the water managers are the experts, and often they have a trusting relation, not always when there's turnover and things like that, but they, through a process of learning and building trust and having relationships with them, their boards and their mayors and city council members, they're looked at as the trusted decision maker. They bring, you know, if they think that that climate information needs to be brought in, they need to do something differently, then they can push that, and because they have that strong relationship, you know, they can move it forward. I've also seen the reverse. In Oregon, at the state level, for example, there was a climatologist there who is now no longer the state climatologist, but he had a huge influence in and the state was sort of resisting any incorporation of climate information into the state planning and allocation, and until he got ousted, and he got ousted because of this interest at the legislature, at the state leadership level that wanted to proceed, and that's what spurred progress. So you see both sides. Sometimes it can be a significant impediment, and sometimes it can be from the water, the water managers pushing it forward.
In your interactions in all these different states, can you comment on maybe the pluses and minuses of cooperative extension service as knowledge brokers associated with some of what you're doing?
Sure. I'm really interested in understanding more about extension and actually water resources research institutes, since they are across the U.S. And I have talked, I think, in every state with, usually with an extension person or with a water resources research institute person, and with, say, for example, the USGS science centers. So extension is interesting. There's a gentleman by the name of David Cash who did work on ag extension and understanding how climate information is brokered, how extension does act as a boundary organization quite effectively. And in this work that we're doing in, which I didn't really talk about, looking at farming practices in Michigan and Ohio. Again, there's a role there for ag extension in informing ag practices and bringing new information in. So I haven't studied them as a primary focus. It's something that I'm interested in, but they certainly play a huge role in our considered boundary organizations for a variety, not necessarily climate information, but for all types of other sorts of information and practical, informing practices, best management practices, and the like. I think that's great.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to head it off here. If you have questions, I encourage you to take them to Knox 201.